Back in October 2019, HBO did something that shocked the entire Game of Thrones fanbase. They spent $30 million filming a full pilot episode for a prequel series starring Naomi Watts, then quietly killed it before anyone outside the company could see a single frame. The show was called Bloodmoon, and it was supposed to be the first spin-off to continue the legacy of one of the biggest television phenomena in history. Instead, it became a $30 million mystery that HBO locked away in a vault. Not even George R.R. Martin himself has been allowed to watch it. So what really happened? The answers reveal some uncomfortable truths about what went wrong with Game of Thrones in the first place, and why House of the Dragon succeeded where Bloodmoon failed. Bloodmoon was set during the Age of Heroes, roughly 8 to 10,000 years before Game of Thrones. To put that in perspective, House of the Dragon takes place about 200 years before the original series. Bloodmoon was going 50 times further back into the past. The show was meant to depict the Long Night, that terrifying period when the White Walkers first invaded from the north and humanity barely survived. Jane Goldman, the writer behind Kick-Ass and Kingsman, was brought on as showrunner. Naomi Watts led a stacked cast that included Naomi Ackie, who would later appear in Star Wars, and Jamie Campbell Bower, who became famous as Vecna in Stranger Things. The pilot revolved around a wedding between a Stark and a member of House Casterly, and would explore the origins of the White Walkers. HBO spent between $30 and $35 million on this single episode. For context, most television pilots cost a few $1,000,000 at most. The pilot was filmed in Northern Ireland during 2019, using some of the same locations from the original series. Then came the October 2019 announcement. HBO was passing on Bloodmoon. The same day, they greenlit House of the Dragon straight to series without even filming a pilot. What happened? Robert Greenblatt, chairman of HBO's parent company at the time, told reporters the pilot wasn't unwatchable or horrible. It was very well produced and looked extraordinary, but here's the key phrase he used: it didn't take him to the same place as the original series. It didn't have that depth and richness. Casey Bloys, HBO's programming president, said it just didn't gel. But if you read between the lines, a clearer picture emerges. The real problem was something HBO should have recognized from the beginning. In Martin's books, he wrote roughly 8 lines of text about the Age of Heroes and the Long Night. Old Man tells a story in the first Game of Thrones novel that takes up maybe a paragraph. Martin admitted in interviews that he didn't have unpublished notes about this period. He never planned to write detailed stories set during the Long Night. The lack of detail was intentional. This era was supposed to be shrouded in mystery and legend. So when Jane Goldman and her writing team sat down to create Bloodmoon, they had to invent almost everything from scratch. The characters, the plot, the dialogue, the political dynamics. All of it had to be created while staying consistent with the few breadcrumbs Martin had scattered throughout his books. Martin himself said it was a very difficult assignment. He stressed that Bloodmoon was mostly Jane Goldman's creation. His role was purely advisory, but the heavy lifting of world-building fell entirely on Goldman and her team. Now here's where the story gets really interesting. This exact problem is what destroyed the final seasons of Game of Thrones. The original show was phenomenal through seasons 1 through 4. But once the series moved past Martin's published books, the quality noticeably declined. Showrunners David Benioff and Dan Weiss suddenly had to make up major plot points and character arcs without Martin's detailed roadmap. The result was the widely criticized final 2 seasons that left fans feeling betrayed. HBO had just lived through that disaster. They watched as Game of Thrones went from being the most critically acclaimed show on television to becoming a punchline. And now HBO was being asked to greenlight a series that had even less source material to work with than those final Game of Thrones seasons. Bloodmoon was essentially asking viewers to invest in a show where almost everything was being invented by the writers. There were no Martin chapters to adapt. No detailed character arcs to follow. Just blank space that needed to be filled. There's another factor people don't talk about enough. Bloodmoon had no dragons. Martin explicitly told Entertainment Weekly that the show was set thousands of years before Game of Thrones, and there were no dragons. Not just no Targaryens or Valyrians. But dragons were one of Game of Thrones' main attractions. The audience loved them, HBO loved them. A Game of Thrones spin-off without dragons was like making a Star Wars show without lightsabers. The same day HBO canceled Bloodmoon, they announced House of the Dragon was getting a straight-to-series order. This wasn't a coincidence. House of the Dragon had enormous advantages over Bloodmoon. It was based on Fire and Blood, a complete book Martin published in 2018 that chronicled the history of House Targaryen. The show focuses on the Dance of the Dragons, a Targaryen civil war about 200 years before Game of Thrones. This period is covered in roughly 200 pages of Fire and Blood, which is still relatively sparse, but it's infinitely more than the 8 lines available for the Age of Heroes. More importantly, House of the Dragon had all the elements that made Game of Thrones successful. Political intrigue, morally complex characters fighting over power, family drama intersecting with larger conflicts, and lots of dragons. The premise was simpler to pitch. 2 branches of the same family, both riding dragons, tear the realm apart in a civil war. It was Game of Thrones with more dragons. HBO decided to bypass a pilot for House of the Dragon and order the series directly. This was partly because they'd already spent $30 million on the Bloodmoon pilot and didn't want to risk another expensive failure. But it was also because they had confidence in the source material. Fire and Blood provided the roadmap that Bloodmoon lacked. And the gamble paid off spectacularly. House of the Dragon premiered in August 2022 to massive ratings and mostly positive reviews. The first season averaged over 29 million viewers per episode. It became one of the most watched debuts in HBO history. Season 2 maintained strong viewership and critical acclaim. The show successfully rehabilitated the Game of Thrones brand after the disaster of the original series finale. Meanwhile, Bloodmoon remains locked in HBO's vault. The pilot has never been publicly screened. Even George R.R. Martin has never watched it. HBO has no plans to release it. It exists as this expensive curiosity, a road not taken in the Game of Thrones universe. There's a lesson here about adaptation. Not every corner of a fictional universe is equally suited to television. Some stories work better as legends that remain mysterious. The Long Night and the Age of Heroes are compelling precisely because we don't know all the details. They're the mythological foundation of Westeros. Making a television series about this period meant demystifying it, turning legend into documented history. Maybe that was never going to work. HBO also learned the hard way that George R.R. Martin's involvement isn't just a nice bonus. It's essential. When the original Game of Thrones series moved past his published material, quality declined. Bloodmoon tried to build on a foundation Martin never fully developed. House of the Dragon, meanwhile, draws heavily on material Martin specifically wrote for adaptation. He's deeply involved in the creative process, and it shows in the coherence of the storytelling. The timing of the cancellation is also significant. Game of Thrones had just ended in May 2019 to widespread disappointment and backlash. HBO was already dealing with a damaged brand. The last thing they needed was another Game of Thrones project that failed to meet expectations. Better to kill Bloodmoon early and move forward with House of the Dragon, a show they believed could actually succeed. In retrospect, HBO made the right call. House of the Dragon revitalized the franchise and proved there was still appetite for quality storytelling in Westeros. If they'd moved forward with Bloodmoon and it had flopped, the entire Game of Thrones television universe might have been dead. The brand couldn't survive 2 failures in a row. By cutting their losses early and pivoting to stronger material, HBO preserved the possibility of future spin-offs. Looking ahead, HBO has several more Game of Thrones spin-offs in development. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, based on Martin's Dunk and Egg novellas, is currently filming. There are plans for a series about Aegon's conquest. Multiple other projects are in various stages of development. All of them have one thing in common. They're based on periods where Martin has written substantial source material. HBO learned their lesson. The hidden reason HBO canceled Bloodmoon comes down to something simple but profound. Television shows need strong storytelling foundations. When Game of Thrones had Martin's detailed novels to adapt, it soared. When it moved beyond that material, it stumbled. Bloodmoon asked HBO to invest in a series with even less foundation than those struggling final seasons. After watching Game of Thrones implode without sufficient source material, HBO wasn't willing to make the same mistake twice. They chose the safer bet with House of the Dragon, and the franchise is healthier for it. So while we'll never see Naomi Watts battling White Walkers in the Age of Heroes, we can appreciate that HBO learned an important lesson about adaptation. Respect the source material, stick close to what George R.R. Martin has actually written, and understand that not every story is equally suited to television. Bloodmoon's cancellation hurt, but it paved the way for House of the Dragon's success and the healthy future of Game of Thrones spin-offs. If you found this deep dive into Bloodmoon's cancellation interesting, hit that like button and subscribe for more behind-the-scenes stories from your favorite shows. Drop a comment below telling me which Game of Thrones spin-off you're most excited about. Are you Team House of the Dragon, or are you waiting for a Knight of the Seven Kingdoms? Let's discuss. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.